I always believed my life had a clear purpose. As a priest, I was called to serve, to guide others in faith, to uphold the teachings of the church, to be a vessel for God's will. For nearly 30 years, I stood before my congregation, leading Mass, delivering sermons, offering counsel and absolution. My parish wasn't grand, nor was it particularly large, but it was my family. These were the people who turned to me for guidance, for reassurance, for the promise that their faith had meaning. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. From the moment I entered the seminary, I felt certain that this was my calling. The church provided structure, order, a way to understand the world and our place in it. The rituals, the hierarchy, the unwavering doctrines all made sense to me. They gave me purpose, a foundation upon which I could build my faith. As long as I followed the teachings, I believed I was walking the path God intended. And so, I devoted myself entirely. Prayer, study, service. My days were filled with tending to the sick, counseling the troubled, and crafting homilies meant to uplift and inspire. The weight of my collar never felt burdensome. It was a privilege. I believed I was making a difference, bringing people closer to God, helping them navigate the hardships of life with faith as their anchor. But as the years passed, small cracks began to form in the certainty I once held so tightly. It wasn't that I lost faith in God, far from it. My belief in Him remained steadfast, but I began to question the institution I had dedicated my life to. At first, the doubts were fleeting, easy to dismiss. A quiet unease when I overheard fellow priests debating politics within the diocese. A lingering discomfort when I witnessed decisions that seemed to prioritize tradition over compassion. These moments were subtle, but they stayed with me, whispering questions I wasn't ready to ask. One of the first moments that truly unsettled me came during a meeting with the bishop. We were discussing a community outreach program, a food pantry for struggling families in our parish. I was passionate about expanding it, convinced that this was the kind of work Christ Himself would have done. But the bishop's response was measured, almost dismissive. "We need to focus on bringing people to the sacraments," he said. "Programs like this can distract from the spiritual needs of the church." I nodded, as was expected of me, but his words lingered long after the meeting ended. Weren't we called to feed the hungry, to care for the poor? Wasn't that the essence of the gospel? I never questioned the importance of the sacraments. They were sacred, central to our faith. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was being overlooked. Over time, these small moments began to add up. There was the wedding I was asked to officiate for a prominent family in the parish, despite knowing the groom had openly disregarded the church's teachings. "It's good for the church's image," I was told. Or the time a single mother came to me, hoping to have her child baptized, only to be turned away because she didn't meet the strict requirements set by the diocese. "Rules are rules," a fellow priest had said when I voiced my concerns. Each of these instances left a mark on me, a growing weight I couldn't ignore. I found myself spending longer hours in the confessional, not for the people coming to me, but for the silence it offered. It was in that small, dark booth that I whispered my own prayers, my own doubts. "God, am I truly doing your will? Is this really what it means to serve you?" And yet, I kept going. I kept the doubts to myself, convinced that if I prayed hard enough they would fade, but they didn't. Instead, they only grew heavier with time. Then came the day that changed everything. It was an ordinary Sunday morning, no different from the countless others I had experienced. The pews were filled with familiar faces, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colors across the marble floor. I was in the middle of the Eucharistic prayer, my hands raised in blessing, when a sudden, sharp pain pierced my chest. At first I dismissed it, a fleeting discomfort from standing too long. But the pain didn't fade. It intensified, radiating down my arm, creeping into my jaw. My vision blurred. The words I had spoken so many times before, words meant to invoke the divine, suddenly became impossible to form. The chalice slipped from my grasp. My knees buckled. I reached for the altar, desperate for support, but the world tilted beneath me. The last thing I saw were the panicked faces of my parishioners as they rushed toward me. Their voices became distant, muffled, as though I was hearing them through water. I tried to speak, to reassure them, but no sound came. Then everything went dark. What happened next is something I have struggled to put into words ever since. There was no fear, no pain, only stillness. A profound, weightless silence, as if I had slipped beyond time itself. I could no longer see the church, the people, or even my own body. Instead, I was surrounded by light. It was everywhere, yet came from nowhere. It wasn't blinding, but all-encompassing, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. In that moment, I knew something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just my body failing. It was something far greater, something beyond human understanding. And yet I wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. At first, I was floating. That was the only way I could describe it. There was no weight, no sensation of limbs or breath, yet I was aware. I could feel, not in a physical sense, but in a way that transcended the body. Then I became aware of something else. Below me, I saw the church, my church. I saw myself lying on the cold floor, my vestments stark against the stone. Around me, my parishioners gathered, their faces twisted in fear and helplessness. Some were praying, others were calling my name, but their voices didn't reach me. It was like watching a painting in motion, familiar yet distant. I wanted to reach out, to tell them I was still here, but I had no hands, no voice. I existed only as awareness, detached from the body I had known for so long. Then, a warmth spread through me, not from below, but from all around. It was subtle at first, like the first rays of sunlight on a winter morning, but it grew, enveloping me completely, and with it came something deeper, something more powerful than words. Love, a love so vast, so pure, that it filled every part of me. I had spent my life speaking of God's love, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of it. It wasn't just something to believe in. It was alive, tangible, wrapping around me like a presence I had known all along, but had somehow forgotten. And then, the world around me began to shift. The church below me faded, its edges dissolving like ink in water. The space around me expanded, transforming into something vast and infinite. I was no longer tethered to the world I had known, yet I felt no fear. The warmth surrounding me pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, and I felt myself being drawn toward it. As I moved, or rather, as I was moved, toward the source of the light, the world around me shifted again. Shapes and colors emerged, flowing and blending like a living tapestry. There were no hard edges, no boundaries, just an endless expanse of radiance and beauty. The air, if it could be called that, was filled with something indescribable, like a harmony that resonated through every part of me. It wasn't music in the way I had known it, yet it was the purest sound I had ever felt. For a moment, I felt as though I had returned home, not to a place, but to a presence. There was no judgment here, no doubt, no need for explanation. I simply existed within something far greater than myself, and it welcomed me completely. But then something changed. At the edge of this luminous realm, a darkness began to take shape. It wasn't like the absence of light. It was deeper, heavier, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. It didn't move or shift. It simply existed, a silent presence that was impossible to ignore. I turned, or perhaps I was turned toward it, and for the first time since leaving my body, I felt something stir within me. Not fear exactly, but a deep, quiet unease. The darkness was not violent or chaotic. It was still, heavy, utterly empty. And yet, despite its stark contrast to the warmth of the light, it felt connected, as though it was not separate from it, but intertwined in ways I could not yet understand. I wanted to turn back, to remain in the warmth, but something compelled me to face it. As I moved closer, the harmony around me softened, replaced by a silence so deep it was almost deafening. And then, within that silence, I felt something watching me. I hesitated, caught between the embrace of the light and the weight of the shadow before me. The warmth I had felt so strongly was still within me, steady like a quiet flame, but the presence in the darkness was undeniable. It wasn't menacing, nor did it reach for me. It simply was, existing in stark contrast to the radiance I had just experienced. And then, without words, I understood. This was not a place of punishment. It was not some abyss meant to strike fear into my soul. It was something deeper, something I had never considered before. A reflection, perhaps. A place where all that was hidden, every doubt, every fear, every moment of hesitation, was laid bare. The shadow did not threaten me, but it did challenge me. I felt a pull, not away from the light, but towards something I hadn't fully grasped. For years I had preached of heaven and hell as separate destinations, as opposing forces locked in eternal struggle. But here, in this place beyond time, I was beginning to see them not as places, but as choices, dimensions interwoven into every action, every thought, every intention. I stood at the threshold, uncertain. Was I meant to step into the darkness, or was I meant to turn back toward the light? And then from the radiance behind me, something stirred, a presence, not just the warmth I had felt before, but something more, someone. A figure emerged from the light. At first he was only a silhouette, a shape against the brilliance, but as he stepped closer, I saw him. His face was unlike any I had ever seen, yet it felt more familiar than my own reflection. It was not the face from paintings or statues, not the imagined perfection of religious art. It was real, alive, and his eyes saw through me, into me, past everything I had ever hidden, and yet there was no judgment in them, only love. My breath, if I had breath, caught in my chest. The figure before me radiated a presence so overwhelming, so absolute, that I felt as though I might dissolve beneath the weight of it. And yet, I was not afraid. If anything, I felt exposed, not in a way that brought shame, but in a way that stripped away every pretense, every mask I had ever worn. Before him, I was not father, not priest, not teacher. I was simply me. He stepped closer, his gaze holding mine, and when he finally spoke, his voice was unlike any I had ever heard. It did not come from outside of me, nor did it echo in the vastness of this place. It resonated through every part of my being, filling the space within me that I hadn't even realized was empty. "Why are you troubled?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. My thoughts, once so certain, now felt tangled. I don't know," I stammered. "I thought I understood. I thought I was doing everything you wanted. But now," I trailed off, unable to find the words to express the weight pressing on my soul. His expression softened, and in it, I saw something I had not expected. Not just love, not just kindness, but sorrow. "You have always sought me," he said, "but you have looked for me in the wrong places." His words struck me like a wave, washing over everything I had held as truth. "The wrong places?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "But I've dedicated my life to serving you. The church, the sacraments, the teachings, they are all for you, aren't they?" He regarded me with infinite patience, as though he had heard this question countless times before. "The church is a guide," he said gently, "but it is not me. The rituals, the doctrines, the traditions, they can lead to me, but they are not the destination. Too often, they become walls instead of doors." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But the church is your body," I argued, my voice faltering. "It's where we find you, where we worship you. How can it not be enough?" His eyes held mine unwavering. "Because it was never meant to replace me." His words hung in the air, wrapping around me like a truth I had always known, but had never dared to acknowledge. "The church was never meant to replace me," he repeated, his voice steady, patient. "Faith is not built on rituals or institutions. It is built on love. True faith cannot be contained within walls or bound by tradition. It lives in the way you see others, the way you serve, the way you love." I felt something inside me tremble. "But I have tried to love," I whispered. "I have tried to serve. I've followed the rules, upheld the traditions, done everything the church teaches, but it feels like it's never enough." His expression remained gentle, but there was something deeper in his gaze, a sadness, not for himself, but for me. "You have done much good," he said, "but you have also carried burdens I never asked you to bear. You have sought obedience when I asked for trust. You have measured your faith by the standards of men, when I have only ever asked for your heart." I closed my eyes, and for the first time I felt the weight of it all, the years of striving, the endless need to be worthy, to be right, to be enough. Tears slipped down my face, though I had no body to cry. "If love is the answer," I asked, my voice barely more than a breath, "then why have we built so much around rules? Why do we teach judgment, penance? Why do we make faith so difficult?" He did not answer with words. Instead, he lifted his hand, and the space around us shifted. The world around us rippled like water disturbed by a single drop. And then, suddenly, I was no longer standing before him. Instead, I was watching scenes unfold before me, moments from my life, from the lives of others. I saw a young boy sitting in the pews during one of my sermons. I recognized him instantly. His father had passed away, and his mother had brought him to Mass every Sunday, searching for solace. I watched myself speaking to the congregation, delivering words of scripture, of tradition, of duty. But then the image shifted, focusing on the boy's face. His eyes were wet, his small hands clenched together. He wasn't listening to my sermon. He was searching for comfort, for something deeper. "You gave him doctrine," the voice beside me said, "when he needed love." The scene faded, replaced by another. A woman stood at the doors of the church, her face hesitant. I recognized her too. She had come to me, asking for her child to be baptized, but she did not meet the requirements. I had turned her away, not because I wanted to, but because the rules dictated it. I saw the moment she left, her shoulders slumped, her hope fading. "She came seeking me," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow, but she found only judgment. The vision changed again, faster this time. I saw faces, so many faces. Parishioners, strangers, people I had counseled, people I had turned away. Moments of kindness, moments of failure. The weight of them pressed down on me. "You have spoken my name," he said, "but have you truly seen me?" I turned to face him, my heart pounding, not from fear, but from realization. "I thought I was doing what you wanted," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I thought I was leading people to you." He reached out, not with his hand, but with something deeper, something that touched my very soul. "You have sought me in rules, in rituals, in doctrine," he said, "but I have always been in love, in mercy, in compassion. Heaven and hell are not places you go. They are choices you make. They are the ways you draw closer to love or turn away from it." The truth of his words struck me like lightning. It had never been about the institution. It had never been about obedience for the sake of obedience. Faith was not a structure. Faith was love. The visions began to fade, but their weight remained, settling deep within me. I had spent my life believing I was leading others toward God, yet now I saw the moments when I had unknowingly led them away, not through malice but through misplaced priorities, through my reliance on rules rather than the simple, boundless love he had always intended. I looked at him, the figure of infinite compassion before me, my voice trembling. Then, "Have I failed you?" His expression did not change. There was no disappointment in his eyes, no anger, only unwavering tenderness. "You have not failed," he said. "You have lived as you were taught, as so many have. But now you see, and knowing the truth is not failure. It is awakening." A part of me wanted to argue, to cling to the certainty I had spent a lifetime building. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after seeing what I had seen, feeling what I had felt. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "If the rules aren't the answer, how do I lead others to you?" He smiled, and in that smile was the kind of peace I had sought my entire life. "Lead with love," he said simply. "Let go of the fear that binds you. Do not seek me in walls or rituals, but in the hearts of those you serve. Show them my love, not through words alone, but through the way you live." The simplicity of it was staggering. Faith had never been about proving worthiness. It had never been about obeying for the sake of obedience. It had always been about love, and love had no barriers, no conditions, no rituals required to be valid. As his presence surrounded me, I felt something shift within me, something breaking free. The weight I had carried for so long, the guilt, the pressure to be perfect, to follow every rule, to hold every line, it all began to fade. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in my life, I knew I didn't need them. As the realization settled within me, the light around him grew brighter, enveloping me in warmth. I felt as though I was being drawn deeper into something vast and infinite, something far beyond the walls of the church I had known, beyond the doctrines I had followed so rigidly. "You've spent your life searching for me," he said, his voice like a gentle current pulling me forward. "But I have always been with you, not in the walls of a church, not in the words of doctrine, but in the love you have given and received." As he spoke, the light around us shifted again, revealing more faces, people I had encountered in my life. Some I had helped, some I had turned away. A mother cradling her child, a man weeping in the confessional, a beggar outside the church doors. I saw their lives, their struggles, their moments of pain and joy, and then I saw myself. I saw the moments when I had chosen love, when I had comforted, when I had listened, when I had lifted another's burden. Those were the moments I had truly been close to him, not in my obedience to the rules, not in my perfect adherence to rituals, but in the quiet, simple acts of love that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with grace. I felt my heart swell with understanding. "Heaven and hell are not distant places," he said. They are the choices you make, the love you embrace or reject. They are not punishments nor rewards. They are reflections of the way you choose to live. The weight of those words was staggering. How had I never seen it before? For so long, I had measured faith in discipline, in sacrifice, in my ability to uphold the expectations of the church. But now, I saw how much I had missed. Faith was not about earning worthiness. It was about recognizing the love that had been there all along and choosing to share it, to live it. The light pulsed around me, growing brighter. I felt myself being pulled toward it, as though I was on the precipice of something greater. And then, with a voice full of infinite kindness, he spoke one final truth. You are free. And just like that, everything faded. I gasped as my consciousness was wrenched back into my body. The warmth of the light, the vastness of that place beyond time, it was gone, replaced by the sterile brightness of hospital lights and the hum of machines around me. My chest ached, my limbs felt impossibly heavy, and I struggled to process what had just happened. For a moment I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of flesh and bone return to me. But something was different. I was different. A movement to my side caught my attention. A few parishioners sat nearby, their faces lined with exhaustion and relief. When they saw my eyes flutter open, their hands clasped together in prayer. "Father, you're awake," one of them whispered, eyes brimming with tears. "We've been praying for you." I nodded weakly, my throat dry as I tried to find my voice. "Thank you," I croaked. They wanted to know what had happened, what I had seen, but I didn't know how to tell them. How could I explain something so vast, so utterly transformative, to people who had never stood in that place, never felt what I had felt? How could I tell them that everything I once believed about faith, about the church, about God himself, had been turned inside out? I wasn't even sure I fully understood it myself. Over the next few days, I recovered in silence. My body healed, but my soul felt raw, exposed. Every ritual, every practice I had once taken comfort in now felt different, like I was seeing them through new eyes. It wasn't that I had lost my faith. If anything, my faith was stronger than ever, but it no longer fit into the structure I had once built around it. I had seen the truth, and now I had to decide what to do with it. Returning to the parish felt like stepping into a world I no longer belonged to. The familiar rhythms of my life, morning prayers, preparing sermons, leading Mass, hadn't changed, but I had. The words I had spoken so many times before now felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge I had carried back with me. I stood before my congregation, reciting scripture, guiding them through rituals, but inside, I wrestled with the truth I had seen. The church had been my foundation, my entire world, but now I saw its limits. I saw how easily rules had replaced love, how rituals had become barriers instead of doors. I had spent decades preaching about God, but now I realized how often I had mistaken doctrine for divinity. I tried to share pieces of what I had learned, carefully at first. My sermons shifted, not in their structure, but in their heart. I spoke less of obligation, more of grace, less of rules, more of love. Some listened, their eyes lighting up with understanding. Others did not. "Father, why haven't you spoken about sin?" a woman asked me after Mass one Sunday, concern in her voice. "We need to be reminded of our duties, our responsibilities before God." I met her gaze, choosing my words carefully. "Sin matters," I said, "but love matters more. If we live in love, if we truly seek to reflect God's heart, everything else falls into place." Her expression tightened. "That's not enough," she muttered before walking away, and she wasn't the only one. The more I spoke of love over law, of grace over guilt, the more resistance I faced. Parishioners whispered. Fellow priests grew wary. My words, though rooted in the very teachings of Christ, were unsettling to those who had built their faith upon the security of rules. Then came the meeting with the bishop. I knew the meeting would come sooner or later. Too many people had noticed the change in my sermons, in my approach. The whispers had made their way up the chain. When I entered the bishop's office, he was already seated behind his large mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "Father," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "there have been concerns." I nodded, bracing myself. I expected as much. He leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. "Parishioners say your sermons have changed, that you've been neglecting church doctrine, speaking more about, how did one put it, personal interpretations of faith. Some are worried you're straying from the teachings of the church." I met his gaze. "Your Excellency, I am not straying from God. If anything, I feel closer to him than I ever have before." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And yet, you have been emphasizing love and grace in a way that some feel undermines the necessity of obedience. The Church has stood for centuries because of its structure, its discipline. If we allow personal revelations to overshadow doctrine, we invite disorder." I swallowed hard. I had once believed that too. "I understand the importance of structure," I said carefully, "but I also know that rules without love can become chains. I have spent my life teaching people about faith, about sin, about what is expected of them. And yet when I stood in his presence, he did not speak of rules. He spoke of love. He showed me that faith is not measured by obedience to doctrine, but by how we live that love in our daily lives." The bishop's eyes darkened slightly. "You had an experience, a profound one, I'm sure, but near-death visions can be misleading. They are not doctrine, and they should not take precedence over the teachings passed down through the Church." His words stung, but I had expected them. I took a deep breath. Then what do I do? Do I ignore what I was shown? Do I pretend I didn't see the ways we have turned faith into something rigid, something fearful, when it was always meant to be freeing? His jaw tightened. "I am advising you to be careful. The Church does not change easily, nor should it. You have a responsibility, Father, to uphold the traditions that have guided generations." I sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. I had given my life to the Church. I had followed its path with every ounce of devotion I had. But now I stood at a crossroads: remain and continue as expected, or follow the truth I had seen no matter where it led me. The weight of the moment settled deep in my chest. For years, I had been shaped by the Church's teachings, molded by its traditions, devoted to its structure. And yet, in that divine presence, I had not been asked about doctrine. I had not been tested on theology. I had simply been seen, known, and loved. And now, I was being asked to choose. I met the bishop's gaze, steady and unflinching. "I cannot ignore what I've been shown," I said quietly. "I cannot pretend that faith is only found in rules when I now know it is found in love first." His expression remained unreadable, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers pressed together just a little tighter. "This is dangerous thinking," he said. "Faith without structure leads to confusion. It is our duty to guide, not to let people interpret God however they please." I took a deep breath, my voice calm but firm. "Faith without love leads to something worse. It leads to fear, to exclusion, to judgment in the name of God instead of grace in his image. I have done that. I have turned people away when I should have welcomed them. I have upheld rules at the cost of compassion. I cannot do that anymore." The room fell into silence, thick with something unspoken. Finally, the bishop exhaled, shaking his head. "Then you will have a difficult road ahead of you." I nodded. "I know." I stood, feeling the weight of finality in the air between us. The conversation was over. As I walked out of the bishop's office, I realized I was stepping away from more than just a meeting. I was stepping away from the only life I had ever known. The walk back to the rectory felt different, heavier. Every hallway, every stained glass window, every wooden pew I passed seemed to whisper of the years I had given to this place. This had been my home, my purpose. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I belonged here anymore. That night I sat alone in my room, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall. I had prayed in front of it thousands of times, seeking guidance, seeking strength. But now my prayer was different. "What do I do?" I whispered. The answer wasn't a voice from heaven, nor a sudden revelation. It was quieter than that, a knowing deep in my soul. I could stay. I could suppress what I had seen, continue as I always had, preaching a faith bound by rules instead of love. But that would be a lie. Or I could leave, step into the unknown, risk everything to live out the truth I now understood. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. The choice had already been made. The next morning I packed my things. I wasn't sure where I would go. I had no plan, no roadmap for what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay, not if I wanted to be true to what I had been shown. Word spread quickly. Some parishioners were confused, others upset. A few came to me, asking why I was leaving, what had changed. "I haven't lost my faith," I told them. "I found it." Some understood, others didn't. But for the first time, I wasn't seeking approval. I left the church, not in anger, not in defiance, but in peace. Because my journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning. I stepped outside the church for the last time, feeling the crisp morning air against my skin. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden light over the stone steps. For years, these steps had carried me into a world of certainty, of rituals and expectations. Now, they carried me into something unknown. I didn't know where I was going. I had no title, no congregation, no role to define me. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. Not because I had abandoned my faith, but because I had finally embraced it as it was always meant to be, without fear, without chains, without the weight of rules that had so often replaced love. At first I wandered, not just physically but spiritually. I spent weeks, then months, moving from place to place, listening instead of preaching, observing instead of leading. I found God not in grand cathedrals, but in the quiet kindness of strangers, in the laughter of children, in the hands of those who helped without being asked. I visited the sick, not as a priest, but as a friend. I sat with the homeless, not to offer them sermons, but to share in their stories. And in those moments, small, fleeting, ordinary, I felt closer to God than I ever had standing at the altar. The church had taught me about heaven and hell as distant realms, as final destinations. But now I saw them for what they truly were, choices we make every single day. Heaven was in the love we shared, in the kindness we offered, in the grace we extended. Hell was in the moments we let fear, judgment, and indifference close our hearts. The truth was so simple, so clear. How had I never seen it before? As time passed, I found myself drawn to places I had once overlooked. Shelters, small-town clinics, quiet corners of the world where people weren't looking for doctrine, just kindness. I met a mother who had been turned away from the church. Her child denied baptism because of rules she didn't understand. I didn't offer her an apology on behalf of the institution. I offered her a listening ear, a moment of understanding. And in that, I saw God's presence more clearly than I ever had in the pages of Scripture. I met a man who had spent years believing he was beyond redemption, shunned for the mistakes of his past. He wasn't looking for a priest. He was looking for someone who saw him as more than his sins. And when I did, when I reminded him that love was greater than shame, I felt heaven touch earth in that moment. Everywhere I went, I saw the same pattern. People weren't searching for rules. They weren't searching for perfect doctrine or flawless obedience. They were searching for love, for the presence of God, not in buildings or rituals, but in the hands that reached out to them, in the hearts that refused to turn away. And I realized that this was my purpose, not to abandon faith, but to live it fully. Not to uphold walls, but to break them down. Not to bind people with rules, but to free them with love. I no longer wore my collar, no longer stood behind a pulpit, but I had never been more of a servant of God than I was now. Because now I finally understood what it meant to follow Him. When I look back on my journey, I don't see it as a loss of faith. I see it as finding faith in its purest form. For so many years, I believed that my devotion to the church was the same as my devotion to God. I thought that following the rules, upholding the traditions, and preserving the institution was what it meant to serve Him. But now I understand that while those things may guide us, they are not the essence of faith. Faith is not about rigid adherence to rituals or doctrine. It is about the choices we make every day to love, to show kindness, to extend grace when it is least expected and most needed. To those who still find their faith within the church, I do not seek to pull you away. The church can be a guide, a light, but only if it does not replace the true source of love. Do not let your faith be confined to institutions or rule books. Instead, let it live in the way you treat others, in the compassion you give freely, in the grace you embody even when no one is watching. And to those who have walked away from faith, who have felt unwelcome, unworthy, or unseen, I understand. I have stood at that threshold, wondering if I belonged. But do not mistake human failings for God's absence. He has never been confined to a building or a hierarchy. He is in the smallest acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of mercy, in the love that exists even when no one is preaching it. Heaven and hell are not distant realms. They are here, now, woven into every decision we make. Heaven is found in love, in the way we lift each other up, the way we choose to see God in those who the world so often ignores. Hell is found in turning away, in letting judgment and fear take the place of compassion. I no longer fear the unknown. I no longer cling to rituals for the sake of comfort. Instead, I walk forward in faith, knowing that God's love is not something to be earned, it is something to be lived. And so, I invite you, choose love, not because it is easy, but because it is the only thing that truly matters. Every moment, every interaction, every decision, let love be the guide. When faced with fear, choose love. When confronted with judgment, choose love. When uncertain of the path ahead, trust that love will always lead you home. Because heaven is closer than we think, and so is hell. The choice is ours, every single day. And in the end, that choice is what will define our faith, not the rules we follow, but the love we give.